Good morning, Morai Rabotai. We are continuing on Masechet Chagigah, and we are holding on Daf Chaf Bet, Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top of the Amud. The learning today of Amud Yomi is Lizchut Yusha ben Dina Diara and Yael Bat Rivka, and we are amidst the explanation of the very first din and halacha of the Mishnah in Chomer Bakodesh Mi Bateruma, 10 or 11 different items that differentiate between the stringencies of Kodesh versus the leniencies of Teruma. We mentioned that later on we're going to have the other way around, also certain items that Teruma is more stringent, but the 10 or 11 is because there's a machloket between Rav Ila and Rava on the very first item in the Mishnah, which is En matbilim keli betoch keli. You cannot use a double layered, so to speak. You can't place your vessels inside a larger vessel and dunk them, knock them off all at once, putting them in the mikveh. You have to do them one by one. For Kodesh, for Teruma is fine. For Teruma you could do all of them at once. And Rava understood the reason to be because of a gezerah. Maybe you're going to use an outer kli, which its opening is less than shfoferet anod, which the eruv mikvaot, the mixing of mikvaot has to be a minimum of shfoferet anod. We mentioned is 2 etzbaot, being able to be turned around easily. And if you have smaller area than that as the petach, as the opening of the kli, that is not considered iruv mikvaot. Therefore the water inside of the outer vessel is not connected halachically, is not considered connected with the mea mikveh, the water of the mikveh. Therefore it does not accomplish tahara for those needles and small items that you put inside the kli. And because you may end up with that scenario, we just don't let for Kodesh being matbil keli betoch keli. That's what Rava said. Rav Ila earlier on had said that the reason is much more simple. It's because of chatzitza. You place a heavy kli onto another kli and then you dunk them. We are worried and concerned that the water is not going to be free-flowing and getting into all of the crevices and the bottom part of the kli, and therefore the tevilah will not be good. And that's the reason, chatzitza. So those are the 2 reasons. And of course, according to Rav Ila, how many concepts do we have in the Mishnah? 10. According to Rava, how many concepts we have in the Mishnah? 11. That's the machloket that we explained. The entire shiur yesterday was basically this machloket Rava and Ila. But we're not done with the machloket Rava and Rav Ila yet. The Gemara over here asks, now, my ika ben the Rava le Rabbi Ila. What is the difference halachically? What's nafkamina? Who cares what the reason is? Does it make any halachic nafkamina in practice? Is there a case that according to one of them you could do it, and according to the other one you would not, which would be a practical reason difference in the halacha lema'aseh based on the reason of the Mishnah of en matbilin keli betoch keli? And the Gemara says yes. There is a case which according to Rava it will be fine, and according to Rav Ila would be a problem. So what is that? My ika ben the Rava le de Rabbi Ila, ika benai hu salve gargutni. Salve gargutni are very large baskets and vessels. They always come in large size. They're massive. They never make them small. So you will never ever have a sal or a gargutni that its opening would be smaller than shfoferet anod. Doesn't exist. It's its own category of kelim, and they're always made large. So says the Gemara, how about using salve gargutni as your outer kli for making tevilah? Are we going to allow that and say, well, if you're using a sal or gargutni as your outer kli, it will never be a problem of smaller than shvoferet hanot, because they don't make them like that even. And therefore, let's allow, as an exception, that you could always use a sal or a gargutni as your outer kli. Or do we say, well, the reason is chatzitza, and sal and gargutni actually has more problem of chatzitza because you could put heavier vessels inside them being bigger, and therefore it will be a chatzitza when you dip them in the mikveh together. And that's exactly what's going to be. Says the Gemara, sal gargutni is ika beinayhu shemile'an kelim ve'itpilan, that you fill them up with vessels, smaller vessels, and you dip them in the mikveh. Leman damar mishum chatzitza, according to Rabbi Ilam, that the reason is for chatzitza ika. Then the same reason of chatzitza applies here, if not more. Leman damar mishum gezerah shema yatbil machatin v'sinorot b'kli she'en b'piv k'shvoferet hanot, according to Rava, that the reason is you may come to dip, put small vessels inside an outer kli that has a narrow opening, and the narrow opening is not considered a chibur, a connection between the water inside and the water of the mikveh outside. She'en bepihen, that sal v'gargutni she'en bepihen kishvoferet hanot leka. You never have a sal v'gargutni that they don't have shvoferet hanot opening. Sal v'gargutni is always huge. And because of that, if you would ask Rava a shayla, say, I want to use sal v'gargutni. Mishnah says, you can't do kelim betoch kelim. Mishnah says it. Can I use a sal or a gargutni? He would say, yeah, kol hakavot, no problem. The Mishnah says, you can't do keli betoch keli. Rava said, the Mishnah is talking about regular vessels. Sal and gargutni, they are different category of vessels, and they never ever come small. And therefore, we are not concerned that if we allow to use sal and gargutni as your outer kli, that you're going to end up winding up in a situation, in a scenario, that you will be dipping in a kli that has a very narrow opening. So that would be the practical difference between Rava and Rabbi Ila. Says the Gemara, if you remember, we promised that we're going to speak about something very interesting, and the Gemara is going to get into that right now. As the Rava letame, Rava holds like his own consistent shita. The Amar Rava, salve gargutni shemile'an kelim ve'itpilan teorim. Rava said in a different place that if you use salve gargutni, these large vessels, if you use them as an outer kli in order to dip in the mikveh, and you filling them up with other vessels, that, says Rava, is fine, no problem. Salve gargutni shemile'an kelim, that you fill them up with other vessels, ve'hitbilan, and you dip them in the mikveh teorin, everything is tahor. Now we have another halacha that Rava said about sal v'gargutni, and this is interesting. Umikveh shechalako besal v'gargutni. If you took this sal, now the sal was made out of weaving together branches, for instance, of palm tree, and you made a basket with it, right? Now, when it's still soft and fresh, you could push them into a hole. If you have a large sal, a large basket, you could push them inside in the middle of the mikveh. Imagine if this is your mikveh, and you're pushing it in the middle, right over here, in a way that it squeezes the sal between the two walls, and there is no way for the water to be connected unless through the holes of the woven parts of the palm tree, right? The palm leaves.
It's a wicker basket.
Sorry?
A wicker basket.
Yeah, wicker basket, but it has to be, it's not round, because then you would have a shofeferet hanod on the bottom, shofeferet hanod on the corners. We're talking about the case that every bit of the corners is covered with this basket. It's a basket that is rectangular, right? And you pushed it in, and now it made like a mechitza in the middle of the water of the mikveh. But the waters are still attached, right? If we pour dye in one side, it will dye the whole water. Because the waters there are thousands of holes in between, and the water is going and coming. So is that a kasher mikveh or not? What do you say?
I'd say yes, because the water goes through all the way.
Well, a lot of people would say yes, right? Rava says no. The mikveh is pasul. Why is the mikveh pasul? Because, we just mentioned before, you have to have shvoferet hanod. And you don't have shvoferet hanod. And Rava says, I will prove it to you. Because every natural mikveh is like this. Says Rava, let's read it inside. Ve'amar, ואז רבא תעמד אמר רבא סל וגרקותני שמילאן כלים והתפילן טהורים ומקווה שחלקו בסל וגרקותני, if you divide the mikveh to two using a sal וגרקותני, הטובר שם לא עלתה לו טבילה. Regardless of what side of this you dunk in, it's not going to be a kasher tvilah, given that side does not have 40 cells by itself, of course, right? If that side has 40 cells, the shiur of mikveh, you're good to go. But if each one of the sides is less than 40 cells, then you're in bad shape. Rava says, I'll prove it to you. Because every natural body of water, right? How did water end up in a hole naturally? Because the reservoirs underground of water, they're all attached, right? And the water seeps in little by little from wherever it is coming from to this hole that was created. Right? When you dig and you hit water, how does that happen? Because there's water underneath the ground, and this is more complicated than we're making it to be. But there are, depending on the heights and the bedrocks under the ground, this is a whole sophisticated chokhmah behind this. But lemaaseh, you hit an area that is connected to the underground waters, and you can have a lot of holes that are connecting these things together. So it is connected with massive, large amounts of underwater reservoirs. But nevertheless, you have to have how much? In one place? 40 cells in one place. You can't say, well, I just hit the water, right? And how's the water ending up under the ground? Because it's connected with larger bodies of the water, so I should be good to go. Even if it's only 20, 30 cells, I should be good to go, given that I could fit my entire body, of course, inside of it, right? I should be good to go even if I don't have a full 40 cell. Because this water underneath ground with tiny holes is connected to other amounts of water. So altogether it will be for sure more than 40. Well, we don't say that. You need to have gathered water at least an amount of 40 seah in one place. Or if you don't, you at least have to have a shvoferet hanod, which connects the two bodies of water. So hence small holes of the basket is not going to be considered a connection of a iruv of mikvaot, even though that technically speaking, this is one mikvah, I just put a sal inside of it, says Rava, that mechitza makes it not to be kasher anymore.
So this is not even talking about putting items in the basket, this is the basket itself would render the mikvah puzzle. That's
correct. That's the second halacha that Rava taught us about sal v'gargudni. No, not connected with the other sugya that we just said. This just happens to be another halacha about sal v'garkutni that Rava taught.
So what's interesting is the basket itself, it doesn't have sal v'garkutni, and you're putting objects inside of it. It should be separating somewhat from the mikveh then.
No, well, if you have a larger mikveh and you're just using the sal not this way, but you're just dipping it in and taking it out, that would be the first sugya.
But if you were to do it upside down or something, actually the water would come from underneath. It's the same issue.
Yeah, of course. You're asking a different question. Yes, very good question. In other words, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, if you have a deep sal and you're dipping it in the mikveh, you can't just push the sal a little bit in the mikveh and the top edges of the sal are still outside the water, and say, well, the water, there's a whole pool of water inside the sal, and that's mikveh. You can't do that because that's not considered mikveh. That's a separate basket of water. It's not mei mikveh until you have chibur from the top. So you have to dip completely in. And this is actually something that happens because you have many mikvaot of kelim. It's a very, very valid point. You have mikvaot of kelim that, you have baskets and you put it in and they take it out. According to what we're saying, again, while we're not discussing halacha here now, but according to this Rava over here, well, do we have a shoferet hanod? No. Therefore, it will not be kasher. You have to, completely dip it in until the water overflows from the top and you have enough iruv over there on the top. So says the Gemara. Now for what we promised yesterday. How in the world do you have a bottle that's narrow on the top become tahor altogether to begin with? In other words, if your metal bottle, glass bottle became tameh, now you want to do tefillah on it, and you say, well, how does that work? Because when I dip this in the mikveh, the water that enters the bottle is not connected with the water outside the bottle, and that's a problem. That's a problem because shoferet hanod is the minimum of iruv mikvaot, so inside the kli also has to become toveld, and it's not. So how does that work exactly, says the Gemara? And the Gemara answers it. V'hanimili bekli tahor. That is only when the outer kli is tahor, then you cannot fill it up with small vessels and dip it for kodesh, right? You cannot do that. And again, over here, we mentioned that for teruma also you cannot do it if it's actually smaller. So says the Gemara, that's only when you have the outer kli be tahor. So the outer kli doesn't need tevilah. You are only using it as a container. Oh, you're using it as a container, the water that pours inside of it is not connected to the mikveh, it's not good. But if you have the outer kli itself as a kli that needs a tevilah, is tameh, then how do you think it becomes the tahor? It's mei mikveh that's pouring in, and that's the only way to do taharat mikveh for this kli, and therefore it does work for the kli itself. Now, you cannot say that if it works for the kli itself, it's not going to work for the things that are inside of it. Because that would be an oxymoron. It does not work like that. If the water is cleansing, is being matbil, the tefillah working for the inside of this vessel, the inner part, not just the out. So anything that's inside here now is also becoming tahor by definition, because if you say not like that, it will become something that makes no sense. So therefore, says the Gemara, that's only if the outer kli is tahor that it doesn't work. But if the outer kli itself is tameh, and you fill it up with smaller vessels and you dunk it, that would be now good. Now this is getting into a whole mikvaot sugya of if it's upward, if it's downward, does it work? If it's sideways, it works. We're not getting into the depth of this sugya. It's a very complex sugya, but nevertheless, at least conceptually, we have this item that this topic. Then you have a very interesting difference depending on if the kli itself needs tevilah or if the kli itself doesn't need tevilah. If the kli needs tevilah, then you are good to go even for the small vessels that you put in, because the water is considered mei mikveh for the outer vessel. So once you're at it, it will be considered also mikveh for a chibur, a connection to the outer mikveh for the small vessels inside. So in other words, if I have this cup, right, that I have, if I have a cup over here that I filled inside of it, and this is, imagine, less than shoferet hanod on the top, but if I fill this in with kelim and I'm just straight up dipping this inside the mikveh, So inside of this needs tevilah. And if this is tameh, the only way that it will become tahor is if the water touching inside is water of mikveh. So once it's considered water of mikveh for this vessel, which is the only way that this could become tahor, then it will also work for the things inside of it. But we're not bothered with this whole shfoferet hanod that we mentioned. But if this outer kli is tahor itself, this doesn't need my tevilah. We're just using this as a container for what's inside of it, the small vessels that need tevilah. And now you dunk this in. We say, well, if it's not k'shfoferet hanod, we follow the regular regulations of Hilchot Mikvaot, and less than a shfoferet hanod would not be considered a chibur, and hence it would not be good. So says the Gemara. Our bekli tameh, when the outer kli is tameh, migu the salka tvila lekuleh, gufe the mana salka lehunami lekelim. Since it works the tevilah for the entirety of the outer kli, including its inside wall, it also works the tevilah for the smaller vessels that you have poured inside, you have filled inside of the kli, the itbe, ditnan. And this is a Mishnah, beferush, discussing this in Mikvaot Perek Vav that we mentioned yesterday. Kelim shemilaan, kelim veitbilan. If you have other larger vessels that you fill them up with other small vessels and you dip them in the mikveh, hare elu teorin. Tahor. Wait a second. We just mentioned in our Mishnah that you cannot do tvilah of keli betoch keli. But the Mishnah in Mikvaot says, if you did it, they are tahor. ואם לא טבל מים המעורבים עד שיהיו מעורבים כשפופרת הנוד. And if you did not do tvilah, then מים המעורבים עד שיהיו מעורבים כשפופרת הנוד. They're not considered mixed until it's as wide as shfoferet hanod, which is a very cryptic language. And the Gemara asks, says, what did he say? What does the Mishnah mean exactly? Im lo taval, it sounds like if you did not do tevilah on the outer keli, then it doesn't work, which is exactly the opposite of what we just said. Right? The Mishnah in Mikvaot seems from outside, that if you didn't do tevilah on the outer kli, then you need a shefoferet hanod. What says, well,
didn't dunk the whole thing.
What are you saying exactly? Mara says like this. Ve'im lo taval, hechi kamar. How is the Mishnah saying im lo taval, that if you did not do tevilah, did not dip this in the mikveh, ve'im eino tzarich latbilo. That's what it means. It means if you don't need the tevilah for the outer kli because it's tahor, if you don't need to dip the outer kli, the mikveh, because it's tahor, it's not tameh, then you need the mayim meoravin. The water is not considered mixed achiyu meoravin kishfoferet hanod until they are open. The kli is open on the top kishfoferet hanod. Then will be a mixed mikveh. So in other words, that's exactly the concept that we mentioned right now in the Gemara, said in the Mishnah in Mikvaot Perek Vav, tucked away, that if you have the outer kli tameh, then you don't need shfoferet hanod. But if you have the outer kli tahor, that it itself doesn't need tevilah, then for the water going inside of it, for that water to be considered attached to the mikveh, you need at least an opening of shfoferet hanod. So says the Gemara, V'had Rava, V'd Rabbi Ila, Tanaihi. This machloket Rava and Rabbi Ila, it's really machloket Tanai. Now Rava is Amora, Rabbi Ila is Amora. But says the Gemara, this is already discussed in the time of Tanaim, as I will show you. The Tanya, we learned in the Braita, Salve Gargutni, another memory about Salve Gargutni, these large vessels of Salve Gargutni, Shemile'an Kelim Vit Bilan, that you filled them in with vessels, smaller vessels, vehit bilan, and you dip them in the mikveh, ben le kodesh, ben li truma teorin. They are tahor both for kodesh and for teruma. How does this work like? Whose shita does this go with? Well, let's see. According to Rava, that the reason of keli betoch keli is because of shvoferet hanot. This makes sense because sal v'gargutni, they will never be that small. But according to Rabbi Ilah, does that work? Chatzitza? It would never work according to Rabbi Ilah. Because if you have this large basket and you fill it in with vessels, heavy vessels on top of one another, of course it's going to be a problem of chatzitza. So you see, this Mishnah, the first part of the Braita, is like Rava. That they are tahor even if you filled the basket in and you dipped it. Abba Shaul says, no, you cannot do that. Litruma avalo lekodesh. You could do it for teruma, but not for kodesh. Which is, again, like our Mishnah, that you could do batbilin keli betoch kelim for teruma, but not for kodesh. So you see exact machloket of Rava and Rabbi Ilah is really the machloket of Chachamim on Abba Shaul. Chachamim hold like Rava that the reason is not chatzitza, the reason is shvoferet hanot, and Rabbi Ilah is like Abba Shaul, who is more machmir over here and holds that the reason is chatzitza, and therefore you cannot do even with sal ve'gargutni. So says the Gemara. Now this is a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara basically asks the elephant in the room. Everyone has been bothered with this. Like, sometimes you just check the box to say, well, it's Taharot, we don't understand it anyways, so let's just read the Gemara and get it over with, right? But the elephant in the room is, wait a second, what's the difference exactly between Terumah and Kodesh over here? Yeah. Both of them are Kadosh. This is Shilishi, that's Reviyah. We get it. We get it that Kodesh is more important. Fine. But what's the difference? Why? Terumah is pretty Kadosh also. Why am I not machmir by teruma? Why? And there is an actual, tangible reason behind it, and I find this Gemara absolutely fascinating. Says the Gemara, Yachi teruma nami. If you're concerned about this, let's be concerned for teruma also. Wow, teruma is not good enough. It's not holy enough. Why is it only by Kodesh? Says the Gemara, it's very simple. Leman kamrinan. Who are we saying this halakha to? Who cares to ask a question about the halachot of Tumah v'Tahara, how to do the tefillah? Only the Talmidei Chachamim, only the people who are careful with Taharot, which we call them chaverim, right? We mentioned this before. A chaver asks a question. And Amaretz, an ignorant that's not so careful in the laws of Tumah v'Tahara, is not going to ask a question. He does what he does and he goes on with life. So therefore, the Chaverim, they already know the halachot. The Chaverim know the halachot and they know how to do a tefillah inside another keli, and be careful that the opening of it is a minimum of shvoferet hanot. Therefore, for terumah we let it happen. You're asking why for terumah we let it go, for kodesh we don't? Because who's asking a question? Tell me, we know that you have to have a minimum of shvoferet hanot. We're not concerned about it, right? So let's see inside, because this causes a much bigger problem now, and it's going to be a chain of back and forth until we get to the actual reason. Says the Gemara, "V'chaverim medayadi." The chaver knows how to do the tefillah with shvoferet hanot. The Gemara says, wait a second. If you're asking chaverim, so they also know about kodesh. So why you machmir mima nafshach? However you slice this urine in hot water, because I asked you from teruma. Said why by teruma you're machmir, by you're mekel rather. Why by teruma you're mekel? He said because chaverim know how to do it, and you're not concerned. So if that's the case, why by kodesh you're machmir? Say the same thing. Who asks questions about kodesh? Chaverim. And Chaverim know not to do it in a smaller with a smaller hole than shfoferet anot, so let it go. Why you machmir by kodesh? You see the frustration. What's the difference? However you slice this, it should be either this way or that way. Says the Gemara, no. Chazile amhares vazil matpil. You know the problem is not because of the chaver. Chaver is going to do it right. You're correct. But the amaretz, the onlooker, the guy that sees him use a vessel that has exactly shefuferet hanod, maybe a little bigger, right? It says, oh, I didn't know that I could do it in a barrel or in a bottle. Gewaldig. Next time I'm going to do it in a bottle. And he's going to use something that's smaller than shefuferet hanod. And he's going to use it for kochim. He's going to be metameh de kochim, the amaretz. So what's the obvious follow-up question?
What's the difference?
Again, what's the difference? If you're choshet, until now we thought that the problem is the person doing the tefillah itself. But now you're saying, no, they are chaverim, they know. The problem is the onlooker. So if the problem is the onlooker, so why are you mekel for terumah? Why aren't you concerned that the amaretz is going to see the terumah, you're doing the tefillah for terumah, and he's going to go do it, and he's going to do it less than shvoveret, and it's going to be metameh the terumah. Says the Gemara, terumah nami chazile amaretz vazil matpil. Well, says, no, that's not a problem. You know why? Lo mekabelin minayu. Because you're not going to accept that terumah. If I'm a kohen, and amaretz brings terumah for me, I say, I have stomachache today. You know, I'm not going to accept it from him. So says the Gemara, Kodesh Nami. So again, you see how this goes back and forth. You haven't given me something substantial yet. Kodesh also, he comes with the Kodesh, I say, I have stomachache. I'm not going to accept the Kodesh. Says the Gemara, Havya le'eva, you can't do that. Because terumah is something personal. You take your terumah to a Kohen. Terumah is something personal. You take your terumah to a Kohen. This Kohen says no. Say, okay. I always knew that this guy is weirdo. I'm gonna go find my friend. And he goes, finds a Kohen Amaretz, and so the world goes on. Nothing breaks. But Kodesh, you're talking about communal things here, right? Comes to Bet HaMikdash, you don't accept it, you'll be in big trouble, right? As the Gemara is going to say in just a moment. So says the Gemara, if you don't accept Kodesh, it'll be Eva. The Gemara says, wait a second, what's the difference? Terumah also is going to be Eva. If you don't accept it, it's going to hate you. So what's the difference again? It says no. Lo ichbatle. He doesn't care. For Terumah, if this coin doesn't accept it, you go to the next coin. And therefore it doesn't create Eva. He just says in his mind, I knew this guy is off the chart anyways. He's going to go find someone else. But for Kodesh, you can't do that. The Azil Yayiv le Kohen Amaretz. For Terumah, he goes and gives it to Amaretz. But for Kodesh, it's not a difference of Amaretz. It's a communal thing, as we're going to see in just a moment. Like, he's dealing with Kochim, he's dealing with communal things. And the guy comes to Bet HaMikdash, and you're like, oh, you're Amaretz. And because we allow the chaver, the Talmid Chacham, to dip in a kli that's narrow, but it's shoferet hanod, right? Because we allow that, then Amaretz may do it in less than shoferet hanod, which would mean that we no longer could trust Amaretz tevilah for kochim, because he may have been in a less than shoferet hanod connection, and therefore everything is tameh, and therefore it's kochim he can't accept. And now that he comes to Bet HaMikdash and brings something, we say, oh no. If you say, oh no, you know what happens? He's going to go build his own Bet HaMikdash. Gemara is going to say that. It's a community. You cannot do that. He's going to create Eva. And next Gemara is an absolutely fascinating Gemara about this communal versus personal. That the Gemara says if you do that, they're going to go and create their own religion, create their own paraduma and their own mizbeach and their own seder ta'ara, and therefore you have to be very mindful of this. It's a fascinating Gemara that we're going to Be'ezrat Hashem do in the next shiur.